The Gettysburg Foundation, the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service at Gettysburg, is pleased to collaborate with Gettysburg National Military Park to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts to this program each year to share their unique perspectives on the Battle of Gettysburg and the American Civil War with our visitors. Our next speaker, Dr. Martin Johnson, will discuss Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg. When Lincoln stood on the speaker's platform at Gettysburg, he had traveled a long road, one that had become more meaningful with each step. Reconstructing Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg reveals a new and more radical vision of the war's meaning, a new understanding of the American experiment announced by the new birth of freedom. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor of history at Miami University, Hamilton. He has published 2 books on 19th century French history, but his main research interest for the past decade has focused on the American Civil War. His most recent book, Writing the Gettysburg Address, won the 2014 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and resolves long-standing mysteries about how Lincoln wrote his most admired speech and proposes a new interpretation of its place in Lincoln's political development. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Johnson.
Thank you very much. Is the mic working? Thanks very much. It's great to be here on the 5th of July, which we were touring the battlefield yesterday, my family and I, and we realized that yesterday was Saturday the 4th, which was also Saturday in 1863, and it was rainy yesterday, just like 1863, so we're recreating the whole thing. And I want to talk to you today about how Gettysburg made the Gettysburg Address in a way. Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg really was created by the process of getting from the White House to the speaker's stand on the battlefield. And it's really about how is it that we create these iconic moments that we know so well. We see images and scenes, Iwo Jima, the moon landing, and sometimes we think, well, these well-worn, well-known episodes of history have been idealized, or perhaps we are putting a little bit of gild on the lily there for the kids in the school books and things. But I want to tell you today that the Lincoln at Gettysburg really did happen. It's an authentic story. It's an authentic legend is what I call it, because there's something that happened at Gettysburg as Lincoln stood on the stand that created the legend of Gettysburg. The legend of Gettysburg grew organically out of the actual event. It was not overlaid later. It was not created later. But understanding how Lincoln created the legend of the Gettysburg Address is really also about how Lincoln created the Gettysburg Address itself, how he wrote it, which is what the book I wrote was about. Because we'd known for a long time that there had been 5 different versions of the Gettysburg Address, which version was first, you know, how did Lincoln write the Gettysburg Address? Was it written on a train and the scraps of paper and things like that? So I tried to also answer those kinds of questions about how Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address. But I was shocked and surprised to find that telling the story of how Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address was also the story of how we went from the, you know, backwoods boy of Illinois and Kentucky to the iconic image that we have in the Washington Memorial, in Washington. So let's, you know, think a little bit about what this Lincoln image is. A Lincoln who stood forth and spoke ideals and abstract notions. But I'd also like to suggest, too, that part of the creation of the Gettysburg Address was that it arose from the politics of the moment. The speech, the Gettysburg Address, was a partisan speech in many ways. It was a speech that created strong political opposition, strong political support. So in the context of 1863, it was a partisan speech, whereas today we think of it as an abstract, high speech with ideals that everybody can agree with. Well, we agree with it today because Lincoln created the Gettysburg Address, created the image and the legend that we then all can, over time, support and understand those ideas of all men are created equal and the new birth of freedom. So let's take the trip with Lincoln to Gettysburg. You know, as I say, he started out in Washington with one version of the speech. He ended at Gettysburg with a different version. And so the journey, the actual experience of the town, the experience of the ceremony, standing on the field of battle and looking at the graves of the soldiers dead, that helped shape the speech. But of course, he got to Gettysburg by the famous train journey, the journey in which supposedly he asked for paper, and somebody picked up a piece of scrap of paper, sometimes said to be a yellow envelope, sometimes a brown wrapping paper, and he sort of scrawled it on his knee as he was going to Gettysburg because somebody perhaps told him just then that he was expected to say something. Well, he knew that he was expected to say something. He was asked for a few appropriate remarks, and before leaving Washington, he had in fact started to write his speech, and he probably had a pretty finished version before he left Washington. We know this because, as he was getting along the train, as he was going along the train, he spoke with people about his words. He went to Hanover Junction. I don't know if any of you get a chance to go up to Hanover Junction. You can still see today the restored building that was there when Lincoln was there. You can see the tracks. Some of them are still there. It's a wonderful sight. It's not too far down the road here. But Lincoln was taking this rail journey with already a speech in his pocket. He did not write on the train, as far as we know. But we know this because Lincoln told his Attorney General in about probably December '64, maybe early 1865, about a year after coming to Gettysburg. Lincoln told his Attorney General about the process of writing the Gettysburg Address. And as far as I can tell, this is a very accurate version of what happened. As James Speed said, the president told me, when requested to deliver an address on the occasion of the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, he, that is Lincoln, was very uncertain about whether his duties would detain him at Washington, but was anxious to go. He did want to go, and desired to be prepared to say some appropriate thing. And that's what he was asked to do, say some appropriate thing. Really, he was asked to participate in a ceremony. They weren't really interested in words so much. Lincoln did not go to Gettysburg in order to give the Gettysburg Address. He went to participate in a ceremony which would include some words of consecration, some words of dedication, appropriate remarks, but it was not intended to be a major speech, and Lincoln did not think of it as the occasion for a major speech in advance, at least. He thought of it as a time to give appropriate, honored remarks that were appropriate for the occasion. And this, as I say, here's Lincoln, you can see in the image perhaps, Lincoln sitting at the desk in the White House. That's the same table that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation upon. Probably he wrote the Washington version, the version in Washington of the Gettysburg Address, on November 17th, because he called to him that night. He called the designer of the cemetery to him to talk about the design for the cemetery. Lincoln wanted to know more about what the landscape would look like, the actual ceremony itself. Speakers, when they're going to go and speak somewhere, they'd like to find out more about what's going to be expected, and that's what he did. He called the cemetery designer to him on the night of 17 November, and probably that night was the night that he finished giving what we think of as his writing what we think of as the Washington version of the Gettysburg Address. And here's what James Speed said. As I said, the day before he left Washington, he found some time to write about half of a speech. So the day before he left Washington was, in fact, November 17. And the Washington draft is what we call this version. It's the, today you'll see it often called the Nicolay version. That is this page here on White House letterhead, Executive Mansion letterhead, German script there. It's a very beautifully written document. There are very few changes except on the very last line. We'll be talking about that. This is a document that he wrote in Washington, probably on the basis of earlier drafts. We do not have those earlier drafts. And probably the night of November 17. It starts out 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Lincoln then in Washington was thinking back to the Revolutionary era, thinking back to the Constitutional era, thinking back to the Declaration of Independence. Because as you know, the battle here at Gettysburg took place around the 4th of July. And as Lincoln said in Washington at that time, it was on the 4th of July that the forces, the Confederate forces turned tail and ran from the battlefield. So Lincoln associated the Gettysburg battle with the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July from the beginning. That's why at Gettysburg in November, comes in November, that's why in November he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. There's no reason to talk about the Declaration of Independence in November unless you've associated the battle already with the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July. That's why we have all men are created equal in that first paragraph. Now Lincoln went, brought this document with him to Gettysburg. It's all in ink, probably on 2 full pages, and arrived here in Gettysburg on the evening of the 18th. of November. And he was met by a large crowd. It was getting to be dark. It was probably dark by the time he arrived here in Gettysburg. Edward Everett, who was the featured orator of the day, the main speaker of the day, met Lincoln at the train station. Of course, you can tour that. You can see that today in Gettysburg. They've done it up in the original colors, I understand, too, in the original paint. So it's really beautiful. And Lincoln then went from the train station, very short distance, of course, up the road, which I'm sure many of you have visited, the Wills House, which is on the main square, of course, here in town, and was then went to the home of David Wills, who was his host in Gettysburg. David Wills was then a rising lawyer, not yet a judge in the town. He had the largest house, evidently, on the main square, and he had, as is famously known, he had about 38 guests that evening in the house. And for our purposes, what's important really is to try to find out when Lincoln may have revised his speech at the Wills House, because we know from various sources that Lincoln did work on the speech in Gettysburg. And he probably did so after being visited by a band, being serenaded, this charming 19th century ritual of a serenade when speakers and great visitors to a town would be feted with a band, and people would say, come out, give us a speech. And of course, Lincoln did that. He stood on the front step there of the Wills House and said a few words, brought a few smiles to the crowd, made him chuckle a little bit, and then went back inside. Lincoln did not like to speak extemporaneously during the war, of course. Then the crowd went next door and heard Seward give a much more red meat kind of speech about patriotism and the greatness of the Union cause. And the bands played all night. But it was after that serenade, which probably took place around 9 o'clock in the evening, it was after that serenade that Lincoln went up to his room. And as he told, again, his Attorney General, James Speed, the day before, we've got that already, the day before he left speech, he took what he had written to him to Gettysburg, then he was put in an upper room in a house, and it was indeed the upper room. Of course, if you've visited the Wills House, you've seen the upper room there. Put in an upper room in a house, and was asked to be left alone for a time. He then prepared a speech, but concluded it so shortly before it was to be delivered, he had not time to memorize it. And so Lincoln felt a little bit of a crush and a rush later when he was describing how he wrote the speech. Lincoln's story of how he wrote the speech is really kind of an eventful narrative of complications, some anxiety about whether he's going to go, some anxiety about whether he's going to meet the mark of appropriateness for the occasion, but then recognizing afterwards that his remarks had inspired on the part of Edward Everett, the most famous orator of the day. Edward Everett gave Lincoln a compliment after the speech that Lincoln said was the most prized compliment he'd received in his life. So Lincoln knew that the journey to his speech was one of complications, even some anxiety, but then a triumph beyond expectation. And that's what he's describing here to his Attorney General, maybe a year after the event. And there's the upper room in the Wills House. You can see the bed today that he slept in. Other sources described a small table that Lincoln sat at as he was writing the speech in the evening. But he probably only worked on it for about an hour up there in the Wills House before it became time to go, and as he called Wills to him, and he wanted to go see Secretary of State Seward, who was staying next door. And here's what I think happened. Lincoln went next door to see Seward, and Seward, probably to get help with the end part of his speech, because Seward had helped him with the last words of the first inaugural, of course. The Mr. Chords of Memory theme was already in there, but was suggested, but Lincoln sort of played with it. Seward also probably helped the last part of the Gettysburg Address. The word perish, in particular, I think. Perish from the earth was a phrase that Seward had used a couple of times in speeches over the previous 10 years. Lincoln did not use the word perish very often, just a few times up to that point, in writing at least, up to that point as far as we know. And so I think when Lincoln went next door to talk to Seward, he was looking for some affirmation, maybe just to speak his words to Seward, to listen himself to how they might have sounded, but also perhaps to get some help with the last part of his speech, because Lincoln knew that Seward was a ready writer, he was a voluble storyteller. Seward was somebody who could always be counted upon. If you needed words, if you needed an idea, Seward was the person to go to. And so after visiting Seward, and probably getting help with that last part, maybe perish from the earth was a contribution of Seward's, Lincoln went back to the Wills House and was seen writing a bit more and copying his speech. The governor of Pennsylvania was in the room at the time, Andrew Curtin, and he said he saw Lincoln copying his speech, which sounds, that word copying sounds like he was taking notes and putting together in a kind of final version. And I think that's what happened. He revised for about an hour in Gettysburg. That means that his speech was pretty much done by the time he got to Gettysburg. Revised for about an hour in Gettysburg, went to see Seward, and then came back and finished up his speech. And that was the speech that I believe he thought he was going to give the next day. The speech that he wrote the night before, what I call the Gettysburg draft, written in the town of Gettysburg on the night of the 18th. That draft was, I think Lincoln believed, going to be the speech that he gave the next day. But something then happened. On the morning of the 19th, Lincoln and Seward had made arrangements to visit the battlefield. Now, there isn't an overwhelming amount of evidence that they visited the battlefield, but I think there's enough, for me at least, to say, yes, they did visit the battlefield. There's contemporary evidence, and here's some of the contemporary evidence. In the newspaper of the day, somebody, it might have been John Hay, in fact, wrote that Seward said to somebody on the stand on the day of the ceremony, "I visited the ground around the seminary this morning, and Mr. Lincoln joined me." So we have very good contemporary evidence that Seward said Lincoln visited the battlefield, and we have a few other scraps of evidence too that Lincoln did visit the battlefield. But this is one of the controversies of the speech about the extent of the visit. But this place that he visited is very significant. The ground around the seminary. Already in November, the battlefield was, of course, taking shape as a site of pilgrimage, and the ground around the seminary was one of the highlights of the tour as it was emerging. It was, of course, a very important building. The cupola, people understood that the cupola had been used as a lookout during the battle. It was a prominent landmark. So the seminary was, as some people at the time said, the seminary is the first place that you visited when you were taking the tour of the battlefield. And then you went down to the Round Tops and up to Cemetery Ridge and other places. But also Lincoln, I think, visited the seminary because that's where John Reynolds, the ground around the seminary, just on the other side of the seminary, is the ground where John Reynolds had been killed, the most high-ranking officer of either side killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln knew Reynolds. Lincoln had offered Reynolds command of the Army of the Potomac just the month before in the White House. Reynolds had turned it down because he was not sort of a political general. He was a battlefield general. He wanted to be out in the front of the forces, and in fact he was. He had three complete corps under his command on the day that he was killed at Gettysburg, but he was probably in front of his troops, leading troops in the battle, maybe 50 yards from the Confederate line when he was shot from his horse and killed. Very famous image of Reynolds being shot from his horse. It was circulated in Harper's Magazine and other prints at the time. Reynolds was a well-known martyr for the Union cause. Lincoln knew Reynolds. Lincoln called him our friend, John Reynolds. And so I think Lincoln visited the ground around the seminary in part because he knew that that was where Reynolds had been killed. Lincoln had also probably seen these images that are so famous because he had visited Gardner's, these are of course Gardner images. He had visited Alexander Gardner's photography studio just a week and a half or so before coming to Gettysburg, when these images, which were newly printed in his catalog as of September of 1863. Gardner would put his images on the wall. They'd be for sale. Going to a photography studio was like going to an art museum at the time, but you could buy, of course, the prints off the walls. And Lincoln visited that studio when these prints undoubtedly were on the walls. Certainly they were in the catalog, and it was his, as I say, Gardner's practice to put on the walls the prints that were up for sale, and people would visit them. We have accounts of people visiting these studios to look at the prints and buy small versions sometimes. And this, of course, is the Gardner portrait that was made on November 8th of 1863. Sometimes it's called the Gettysburg portrait. And I'd like to offer this as the way we should think of Lincoln in 1863. He's not yet the sort of older, wizened, kind of worn-out president who had gone through 1864 and 65 and the horrors of the spring and summer of 64. He's a Lincoln who's, as John Hay called him, was a backwoods Jupiter, organizing the war from the White House, in command in many ways of the largest land forces then on the planet. One of the best armies, of course, in history up to that time, the Army of the Potomac. So Lincoln was a man in full command politically and a full command also militarily. And that's the image I'd like to suggest we have of him at Gettysburg, the so-called Gardner portrait. And that's, of course, Gardner's studio there we see. Lincoln might also have known that a ground around the seminary was near there was where John Burns had fought, famously the only so-called civilian who joined up the day of the battles and fought against the rebel invasion. Burns had become famous, and Lincoln, on the afternoon of the dedication ceremony, specifically called for John Burns to meet John Burns, and Lincoln and John Burns went to a ceremonial event on the afternoon of the cemetery dedication. So Lincoln knew of Burns, or at least knew of him undoubtedly. So there are many reasons that Lincoln would have visited the ground around the seminary: the death of Reynolds, John Burns, the seminary itself. And so that morning then, when Lincoln went back to the Wills house, he engaged that visit to the battlefield, I believe, had changed him. It had sparked something in him. His speech was evolving as he was visiting the battlefield. You could see the bullet marks on the walls. You could see the bark torn off the trees. This was only a few months after the battle. There were still carcasses of horses killed from the battle still in the streets and the fields of Gettysburg at the time. You could see the graves of the Confederate soldiers and many of the Union soldiers that had not been reburied in the National Cemetery. And of course, you could see the lines of battle, the places where the trenches and cannon and other military lines of battle were still quite apparent. So Lincoln would have seen these things. And I think part of this, and thinking about Reynolds and thinking about the battle, on top of his meditations over the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, as he'd already thought about it in Washington, led him to engage in what I call a crash revision of his speech. The speech the night before is not the speech that he gave on the day of the ceremony. This morning, on the morning of the 19th, before going out to the battlefield, he was seen writing and writing right up to the very end when he had to go downstairs to get in the procession to go out to the battlefield, the cemetery dedication. He was seen writing in pencil, and he was seen thinking about his remarks too. From the people down the square below could look up at the window and see Lincoln pacing back and forth that morning as well. And what he did, most likely, he took that first page of his speech that he wrote in Washington, the one on Executive Mansion letterhead, and he changed the last line in pencil with an ungrammatical change, a change that reads literally, "We here be dedicated." And an ungrammatical change, and the dedicated starts on the first page and continues on to the second page in pencil. That second page is in pencil, not in pen. It's on different paper. It's different in almost every way from the first page. And that second page is the page that he wrote that morning in Gettysburg. We have John Nicolay's eyewitness recollection on many of these points too. And what he was doing as he made that change, he was changing the words of the first draft, the earlier draft, which said, that we come to stand here. That first page had ended with the words, "to stand here." And he changed that and wrote, "We here be dedicated," changing stand to dedicated, bringing a new, active, new, more important vision of dedication and devotion to the speech. Standing in the original version is rather passive. Lincoln used that phrase in many ways, but it's always, we stand with the fathers, or we stand with the soldiers. And of course, you are standing for ideals, and that you're steadfast and you're holding true. But to be dedicated is an emotion. It is felt. And Lincoln added then, in this change, the crash revision of the morning, added for the 5th time the word dedicated. We already have it 4 times on that first page. This is a 5th written dedicated. And then when he spoke on the stand, just a few hours after making that change, he will speak a 6th dedicated. 6 times he wanted to make sure that we would be dedicated to the proposition. He also made another change that morning, I believe, in pencil to that first page, where he underlined one word from that first page. The kind of thing you do when you're going to speak and you're thinking about how you want to emphasize your words, what phrases you're going to emphasize and not. He underlined one word in pencil from that ink page, what they did here. What they did here, the sacrifice of the soldiers, their dedication was coming home to him more fully on the morning of the speech as he was preparing to go out to the ceremony after he came back from the battlefield. And as he stands on the stand giving the speech, he will also add and change and spontaneously speak new words. This is a speech that is growing with every step of the journey from Washington to the speaker's stand. That last page, the page that he wrote in Gettysburg, is the first time, as far as we know, Lincoln's use of the word, phrase, a new birth of freedom. And again, this is not an abstract statement. A new birth of freedom goes along with Lincoln's new Reconstruction policy, which he was writing at exactly the same time as the Gettysburg Address. This is the Reconstruction policy that Lincoln will follow to the end of the war, a policy that he called the New Reckoning, a policy that Lincoln called the New Review. And so Lincoln was poetically describing a new birth of freedom when he was talking about his political Reconstruction plans for the Union, which for the first time stated that any state that came into the Union, any state from the Confederacy that came into the Union would have to abolish slavery. This would not be a reunion with slaveholders for the first time. It would not be the Union as it was that was going to be reconstructed. For the first time, Lincoln made this statement. You know, emancipation had already been the policy, but emancipation was a halfway kind of policy. It was a military policy. It was very limited. Slavery would still exist in the Union with emancipation. Emancipation was intended to be a limited policy for military purposes only. But Lincoln, by the time of Gettysburg, which is almost a year after emancipation had been put into effect, Lincoln was beginning to realize that the country born of the Emancipation Proclamation and that would emerge from the war would be a new country, a new union, a new review, a new reckoning, a new birth of freedom. In part because the service of African American soldiers who had proven to white Americans that they would stand and fight on the battlefield. Lincoln was very impressed with the military prowess of the soldiers in the summer of '63 and the fall of '63, the prowess of the African American soldiers on the battlefield. He was among those who doubted whether African Americans would be able to fight with that sort of casual 19th century racism that we all recognize and see. So the actual service of African American soldiers was key for Lincoln in bringing about this new recognition that the new birth of freedom would require civil and political equality. Maybe not social equality. Lincoln maybe wasn't going there just yet, but this is the first time in the fall of '63, early '64, when Lincoln's beginning to work behind the scenes for voting rights for African American soldiers, especially for educated African Americans, as he called them. And he was beginning to take the first steps towards supporting the 13th Amendment, which was abolish slavery, which was a very radical measure, of course, in the course of the war. And that he made the 13th Amendment the sort of cornerstone, the platform for re-election in 1864. The key distinction between him and McClellan was who would support abolition of slavery. And everybody recognized that the Republican Party ran on the platform of the 13th Amendment. And so that's those are the elements of the new birth of freedom, the political elements, the partisan elements that the Democratic Party, many would have opposed bitterly, of course, and all secessionists opposed bitterly. This Gettysburg Address was a partisan speech in the context of the time, but it's become nonpartisan for us because we've inherited the world that Lincoln created. We've inherited the world that was created by the legend of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln created. So Lincoln, having undertaken the crash review, stepped out under the diamond there at Gettysburg. We've all been there, I'm sure. This view is looking south from the diamond down towards the battlefield. The next view we're going to see is looking, we're down at the end of the street and looking up north, and we're going to be looking at the parade. The parade was several thousand soldiers, civic groups, organizations, townspeople. The parade was, sometimes these parades were measured in miles, but this one was rather small, many people thought at the time, because so many people had gone out to the battlefield to try to get a good place in front of the speaker's stand. And we have these wonderful images, and William Frassanito has pointed out that in one of these images, you can undoubtedly, I believe is absolutely true, undoubtedly you can see Lincoln on the horse in the parade going to Gettysburg. I think this should be included in those Lincoln images, the 133 odd, I think, Lincoln images that we recognize as having Lincoln in them. I think this one needs to be included in that list, along, of course, following Mr. Frassanito on that. Going down the route toward the parade, of course, this is an aerial version. I wanted to sort of get us oriented. He would go on to the, for you, the left side of the image, and come up to the battlefield, come up to the cemetery, probably walking straight up through the middle of the cemetery. Maybe he went around to the side of the cemetery. And we're now going to see a view as Lincoln would have seen the cemetery, more or less, as he rode in the procession up to the top of the hill. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a flagpole at the top. We're going to be seeing that flagpole again. Off on, again, the left side of your image, we have the gatehouse of the cemetery. And we have the graves can be seen on this image as well. And a number of sources say that as they got up to the cemetery, the parade became more somber. It begun kind of as a celebration, but as they got to the cemetery, it became more somber because the graves themselves were fresh. Excuse me, I'm going to skip over some of that. The graves themselves were fresh, and people would see the, people would see the graves from the, where they were standing on the battlefield. One of the newspaper reports at the time said that the graves looked like flower beds, raised flower beds, because they were so fresh, and the earth was so apparent and physical. The physicality of those graves came home to everybody. There were bits of knapsack on the ground from the battle still. There were still the detritus of the battle was still around at the time. People were picking up souvenirs. I want to take you now more to the center of the ceremony, where many people have seen Lincoln in some of these images. Actually, I don't think Lincoln be seen in any of these images, but there are now, I think, 3 contending experts on photography who believe they see 3 different Lincolns in these images. Actually, I don't think you can see Lincoln in these particular, these are undoubtedly by Gardner. But let's get closer now to the ceremony. We're standing up on the hill near the town gatehouse, and we're looking down into the main area in front of the speaker stand. The flagpole there is right to the front and maybe to the right a little bit of the speaker stand. Let's go right up to the flagpole and stand in the crowd, right up close. And if we, of course, zoom in on that part of the photograph, we have the famous image of Lincoln actually on the stand at Gettysburg. This one's been recognized since about 1954 as an image of Lincoln. I don't know if you can see it there in that image. This is an even closer image. Lincoln is sitting, his head is tilted, he does not have his top hat on. And that tall figure in front with the top hat on and the sash, that's Ward Lamon. He's on a horse, that's why he's so gigantic. He's in front of the stand on a horse, so there's a lot of foreshortening going on here. Well, that's the remarkable image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. But before we get to Lincoln, of course, we have Edward Everett's speech. And it's been traditional ever since then to compare the two and say, oh, Everett's speech was cold. And, well, it was exactly what was expected. And there are a number of people at the time who heard the speech, newspapermen and others who were actually at the speech, who said it was an impressive and moving speech. Newspaper accounts say that Lincoln cried twice during Edward Everett's speech. When we read about it being a cold speech and overly long, maybe if you're back in Baltimore or New York reading the speech in your study or your office, maybe then it doesn't seem like a very exciting speech. But Edward Everett knew how to put a speech across. He used all the 19th century rhetorical tools to make you feel and know and experience the battle that he described. And Lincoln himself complimented Everett on his speech. As Lincoln stood, he would have seen the graves, the fresh graves, and we have here an image of how the graves were dug at the time. We have images of Lincoln standing on the battlefield, maybe waving his arms around. He probably did not wave his arms around during his speech. Lincoln was, during the presidency, he sought more dignity rather than histrionics when he was speaking. He knew that he was not one of these florid orators. He knew that the strength of his speeches was in the ideas. And so this is probably how Lincoln looked as he stood. Probably just stood with a speech in front of him, with his eyeglasses on, took the speech out of his pocket, and spoke in a clear, high voice, a number of sources at the time call it a clear, ringing voice, a clear voice from Kentucky. And as you may know, it was said that to the end of his life, when Lincoln talked about what you're sitting in here, he called it a cheer. It's not a chair, it's a cheer. So it's the Kentucky was still in his voice to many people, especially on the East Coast. They'd hear it very prominently. And he announced then his speech. And as he gave the speech, it's exactly at those lines that he was working with that morning in the transition to the second page that most accounts of the day suggest this is the emotional high point of the speech. This is the point at which there's stories of soldiers breaking down and crying. Now, many people couldn't hear his words. Many people weren't moved by his words. But enough were to create this image, this authentic legend of Gettysburg. And it's this line here that many focused in as the most important line for them. The emotional high point of the speech, it is quoted time and time again. This particular snippet from the speech is quoted in newspapers and books in the months and years immediately afterwards, even before the assassination. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they here so far so nobly carried on. Thus far, so nobly carried on. And as he's speaking, that fifth dedicated that he added that morning, he repeated for a sixth time, a sixth spoken dedication, wanting to drive that point home. But then also, as he was nearing the phrase, a new birth of freedom, he added perhaps the most famous spontaneous addition to the speech. These words, which in his draft did not exist on the draft that he held in his hand, but he spoke these words undoubtedly. All the newspaper accounts prove that he spoke them. And he said, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom. Under God added to the draft that did not originally have those words. Lincoln had been moved on the stand by the prayer, which was extremely impressive to many people, moved by Everett's speech. Lincoln was feeling that moment, and Lincoln brought his emotional dedication to that moment in a way that people at the time recognized and that we today still feel, that we, when we read those words, when we see the speech, when we think about Lincoln and Gettysburg, he's responsible for creating those words and that image as he stood there looking at the graves before the living and the dead. Now later on, when he revised the speech, he did move the words under God before shall instead of after. He probably said shall under God, and later on he revised it to say under God shall. I'll leave it to you to decide how important the meaning might be for those differences. But those words are in our, of course, Pledge of Allegiance, in large part because Lincoln said those words at Gettysburg. It was in 1954 or so when Eisenhower and others approved and supported placing the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, in part to differentiate the United States from communist Russia, which was, of course, our nemesis in the Cold War in the 50s. So under God was added to fulfill the purposes of the 1950s, but because Lincoln spoke those words at Gettysburg, and today millions of school children every day speak those words in classrooms across the country. So this was a speech that could only have been created as a result of this process I've described here. I don't think he could bring the emotional power to the speech if it was just been written in Washington, sitting at the cabinet table, if he's just sitting there quietly in his office thinking about the Declaration of Independence. And I don't think it could have been written in that just for that. Nor do I think that it could have been written only under the emotional impact of the battlefield and the sacrifices of the soldiers. Really, the 2 pages of the speech that he held in his hand, the speech called the Nicolay version that I call the battlefield draft, the 2 pages, one written in ink in Washington, one written in pencil in Gettysburg, bring together this larger vision of our nation, really, to Gettysburg, from the founding era of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to the sacrifices of the Civil War, which gave meaning and purpose and extended and broadened this promise of all men being created equal, broaden that in new ways that we are still, even today, expanding and thinking about and arguing about what is the new birth of freedom, what is the extent of liberty and freedom in this country, how far and do we take our dedication to equality, where are we going to be, as a nation, how are we going to play with these and institute these ideals? And so Lincoln at Gettysburg created that for us, and that's why we have this iconic image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. So I thank you very much. I'm told that there might be some time for questions. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to take questions about the speech, the myths, the legends, what happened in Gettysburg.
As Lincoln gave the speech and afterwards, and at least some of the things that I'd read, that he felt like that the speech may have not have went over as well as he thought, and those type of things. And since he lived such a short life after that, and in hindsight we can look back today and say what a tremendous speech. Do you feel like at any point in his life from 1863 until his passing there in 65 that he felt like that the speech that he gave was better than what he originally gave, that it would have some type of impact? Did his mind ever change upon the impactfulness of his speech?
Yes, I believe so. It's a great question. I believe Lincoln saw the early emergence of what will become the Gettysburg legend. In his description of how he wrote the speech to his Attorney General, as I suggested, there's signs of anxiety and doubt in the early descriptions of how Lincoln himself described it too. So he said, well, I wanted to go, but I wasn't sure if I could go. I wanted to memorize it, but I wasn't able to memorize it. So there's these elements of not meeting expectations, of anxiety, of being rushed, that he didn't have time to memorize the speech. And again, I think that's because the crash revision the morning of the speech, he did not have time to memorize it. But Lincoln also, as I said, received from Edward Everett this compliment that he'd said more in his 2 lines than Everett had spoken in 2 hours. And Lincoln later said that was the compliment that he felt most deeply. He took his Everett's letter that contained that compliment. He showed it to people in the White House in Washington. He showed it to his son, Robert Todd. And his description then of how he wrote the speech, I think, was in part Lincoln's way of working out, well, how did a speech that had such eventful beginnings create such an important impact? And by the end of his life, there were newspaper articles and journal articles that called it immortal, that were reprinting it. A professor of history from Oxford University in Britain gave it high praise that Lincoln knew about. Lincoln had copied out by hand an excerpt from a letter that a duchess had written about the Gettysburg Address, that it had said that the Gettysburg Address must live in time. So Lincoln himself witnessed the early stages, and I believe his description of how he wrote it was his way of thinking about how did this happen.
Other than the Gettysburg Address, I know it's one of his famous speeches, and we teach it in school even today. Is there another speech of Lincoln's that is one of your favorites, or that we should be teaching in our schools?
Yes, I think the more Lincoln, the better, right? So, yeah, I think the one that often doesn't get as much attention, perhaps as it might, would be the special message of July 1861, when Lincoln was justifying to Congress and to the nation his measures in the early part of the war. Because there he was really building upon an entire vision of American history and then trying to suggest exactly why secession was not the right answer and why it had to be opposed, really in a very important, in political terms, but also out of a deeply rooted political theory that Lincoln held about the nature of the nation and its founding on the Declaration of Independence, not in the Constitution, but on the Declaration.
I have a question. I'm always rather confused about Lincoln because he's known as the great emancipator, and now you're talking about the new birth of freedom. Then he makes statements like, well, a black man should be allowed to vote if he's well educated, or maybe if he's a soldier. Can you comment on that?
Yes, and I think, there is, as I mentioned, there's a kind of, deep-seated structural racism in the 19th century that imbues all of American life and society. And so in that sense, Lincoln emerged from that and was part of that. What many people find remarkable, though, is the extent to which he grew and developed. When Lincoln stood, as you know, in April of 1865 and spoke about publicly giving the vote to blacks who served in the military and who were educated, this was a very radical statement. Only about 6 states in the North allowed voting even by free blacks, and some of those were limited in many different ways. So the concept of African Americans voting at the time was extremely controversial. That's the rock upon which Reconstruction broke apart. The Republican Party broke apart eventually in Reconstruction, and that's the problem of Jim Crow. That's the problem of the next 100 years in many ways. Political power for African Americans in many parts of the reconstructed Union. So Lincoln was moving very far and fast in many ways in directions that were surprising to many at the time. But it's undoubtedly the case that Lincoln held views that we today would call racist, or, you know, in that sense, yeah. But it's difficult to use today's terminology in the past, but I think that's we have to recognize that too.
I was just wondering if you could confirm or unconfirm the notion that Lincoln, in fact, had a copy of Everett. Closer? I was wondering if you could confirm or unconfirm the notion that Lincoln, in fact, had a copy of Edward Everett's address weeks in advance, and if he did, in fact, have a copy, can you elaborate a little bit on that impact of having had free access to that speech?
That's a terrific question. There have been notions that Lincoln did have. I think that's in Chapter 3, so take a look. Lincoln did undoubtedly have access to the speech before, and we know the Edward Everett's speech was in Washington before Lincoln left for the ceremony. There are certain eyewitness stories which may or may not be absolutely verifiable that Lincoln had the speech when he went to Gardner's studio, portrait studio, and I talk about that story in the book, so again, take a look at that. But if Lincoln did have it, and I think he had access to it, he could have, I don't think it affected what he wrote in any significant way. Lincoln was extremely independent-minded, and he was well known for not taking advice, not asking advice. There's quotes by people saying Lincoln never asked anybody's advice in his life. I don't think Lincoln would read the speech by Everett and then say, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this based upon this speech. I think the Gettysburg Address is drawing upon deeper and more long-lived ideas within Lincoln, and not on a particular meditation on Everett's speech. All right, well, thank you very much.